So a while back, King Crocoduck went ahead and made various ignorant assertions about trans children and puberty blockers. And amongst all of this, he referenced 2 cases as examples to show the evils of the trans agenda. That of David Reimer and that of Luna Damon Younger, the latter of which King Crocoduck actively misgendered in his tweet. Now I've already done a video detailing the facts that King Crocoduck was relying on far-right Christian and fascist sources on the Luna Damon Younger case. So if you'd like to know more about that, then please do check out my video linked in the description. It is time for us to move on to review the David Reimer case. We need to discuss the way anti-trans voices are starting to dishonestly frame what occurred to use said case as an attack on trans people. We also need to discuss the harm said case has caused and still is causing intersex people to this day, since they're the ones who suffer the most as a result of the mistreatment David Reimer received at the hands of psychologist John Money. But let's go back to the beginning. David Reimer was a cis male born in Canada on August 22nd, 1965, along with his twin brother, Brian. Now both David and Brian were diagnosed with phimosis, and this is where things start to get incredibly messy. What constitutes phimosis is disputed, even among medical circles. According to who you talk to, phimosis may be defined as something present in nearly 100% of all newborns born with a phallus, or a rare and potentially harmful medical condition. And the problems occur when people operating on the basis of the latter definition start diagnosing people on the basis of the first definition, often due to inadequate training, as has been the case in both the US and even Canada. So rather than taking either the inclusive or exclusive route, I'll be keeping to the 2-type model. There is physiological phimosis, and then there's pathological phimosis. Starting with physiological phimosis, put simply, this is the inability to attract the foreskin, or prepuce as it's medically known, over the glands of the penis. And this is something evidence suggests that as much as 96% of all newborns with a phallus are completely incapable of doing. Now over time the foreskin naturally becomes detached from the glands as well as stretchier, allowing it to draw back. And this can happen over a very long period of time. Whilst many find their foreskin naturally retracts within 6 months, one 2005 study from Denmark found that, and keep in mind that this is a translation, that quote, the boys reported that they were able to pull back their foreskin for the first time at an average age of 10.4, end quote. Quick thanks to Microbloganism for their help in clarifying this translation. So as we can see, not only is this a frequent occurrence, but it's not uncommon for adolescents to attain said trait right up to and even beyond puberty, many without ill effect. The problems emerge when one conflates this with pathological phimosis. That's when the tissue of the foreskin begins to harden, making naturally occurring retraction impossible. Now why is there such an issue with this term and how it's being used? Well, it all goes back to that puritanical Christian mindset that pushed for circumcision as both a medical and moral imperative. Accurate information about normal foreskin development was suppressed, allowing doctors to be taught that normal physiological traits were a cause for concern. Now how do they alleviate said concern? Well, circumcision of course. Now I raise this point since whilst both David and Brian were diagnosed with phimosis and were scheduled for circumcision at 7 months of age, only David was operated on. Brian meanwhile was spared said surgery, and later on his foreskin retracted without intervention. What this suggests is that said phimosis was entirely physiological and not pathological, which makes what happened to David even more tragic. The reason Brian was spared the surgery was because the surgeon who operated on David severely damaged his genitals. Worried about their child's future health, David's parents took him to Johns Hopkins Hospital, and that's where John Money entered the picture. John Money was already carving quite a name for himself with hypotheses about gender and his methods for treating intersex individuals. John Money was of the impression that gender identity and gender roles were one and the same, and therefore since gender roles are socially enforced, so too was gender identity. John Money was also of the opinion that any visibly intersex individual should be reassigned female since he believed constructing a functioning penis to be impossible. So when David and Brian Reimer were brought to him, John Money saw an opportunity to prove his hypothesis. Not only could he work with a non-intersex child, but one with a twin no less, the ultimate control. John Money told David's parents that he'd never be happy with a reconstructed penis, and that instead they should start medically and socially transitioning him into a girl as soon as possible. And the Reimers had seen Money appear on Canadian news to share his views previously. They had no reason at all to distrust him, so they agreed. And at 22 months of age, David underwent his first medical procedure to reassign him as a girl. David's name was changed from the one he'd been given at birth, and he was seen annually by John Money, who assessed him and his development. And from Money's reports, the reassignment was considered to be an overwhelming success. It became known as the famous John Joan case, and was used to argue that gender identity was completely malleable over the next 3 decades. It became the foundation for various models on the subject that are still used to this day. The problem? Money's reporting the situation wasn't accurate. Somewhere between the ages 9 and 11, David began to realize that the discomfort he felt day to day in his life was the result of the fact that he was not a girl as he'd always been told, but was in fact a boy. And this was raised with both Money and the other researchers working on the case, but Reimer was always told that he was a girl, he has to live as a girl, and there's no other way. Over the years, his lack of support festered into anxiety and depression, accumulating to the point that David threatened to take his own life if he were forced to see Money again, aged 13. And 2 years later, David's father finally told him the truth about what had happened to him as a child. That's right. Up to this point, David had no idea that he'd been assigned male at birth, something which says a lot about gender identity and its inherent nature. David Reimer was finally allowed to transition back to the man he had always felt he was, yet sadly much of the damage had already been done. For a start, he never fully repaired his relationship with his parents, and the fallout from what happened caused the family as a whole a great deal of strain. David was haunted by his past abuse, resulting in mental health problems which undoubtedly affected his work and his relationships. He was plagued by memories of Money's twisted sessions with him. Then in 2002, David's brother committed suicide, which heavily impacted him. And in 2004, his wife notified him that she intended to proceed with a divorce. With no support system in place, all of this proved just too much. David Reimer, age 38, committed suicide by firearm. And whilst I can hardly state into the sole cause of David's tragic death, the man heavily responsible for the environment which proved too much, John Money, passed away 2 years after David committed suicide at the ripe age of 84. Now, just to highlight the extremes of what Money did to try and drive home David's womanhood, I'd like to take a look at one of the activities he used to do with the twins. He had Brian, David's twin brother, partake in sexual play with David. Said process involved David laying on his back with his brother Brian, both of whom were still children, laying between David's legs to form the missionary position. Brian would then be asked to perform rhythmic thrusting against his brother's groin, imitating the act of sex, all of which Money forwarded as necessary for successful reassignment. Money also photographed these sessions, yet perhaps most disturbingly, conducted some sessions without the supervision of a second professional. David also recalled that Money would verbally abuse his brother if Brian refused to do what Money demanded. In all, the ordeal was a horrific warning as to what can occur in science if one puts the desire to prove their hypothesis before the well-being of their patients. But how does this relate to trans children and their treatment? Well, for a start, it demonstrates that gender identity is not something we can change. If the combined effort of the medical establishment can't change the gender of a single child, then that won't happen because trans people have a growing presence in society. Also, anime is not turning your children trans, something which sounds like it should be a given, but people actually believe that. As for its application in the way the anti-trans crowd throws it out there, if anything it shows the exact opposite. It tells us that if children were being pushed into transitioning, we'd expect to see the same anxiety and depression as we did with David Reimer in them. But we don't. And that comes down to a very fundamental difference in what occurred here versus what happens with potentially trans children. David Reimer was forced to reassign, in spite of his wishes not to. The same is not true of the various teenagers on puberty blockers. And that's another difference. The most that a potentially trans child will be put on are fully reversible puberty blockers which have no known ill effects. And this is done after the early onset of puberty, allowing an adolescent to delay the process long enough to reach an informed decision with the support of trained professionals. And it's not a case of simply fumbling around in the dark. Studies have found key differences between children who are simply showing behaviours outside of traditional gender roles and those whose gender identity does not align with the gender they were assigned at birth. And as a good consensus does, said understanding correlates perfectly with what the David Reimer case study tells us. The age at which David began to realise that his gender did not align with what money and his parents told him fits in line with this understanding of the recognition of gender identity as one matures. Now, before this video, I had knowledge of David's life, and I always stated that reading what he went through as a trans person looked a lot like gender dysphoria to me. But during all of this, I found some evidence that suggested that David himself made the same connection, something which speaks to the need to support people who think they may be trans at a young age in exploring themselves and figuring out the best path for them. So this transphobic application of the David Reimer case holds no water at all. But as mentioned before, trans people are not the only ones with a stake in this conversation. After David had committed suicide, John Money found himself come under heavy criticism. In response, he asserted that his critics were conservatives looking to protect gender stereotypes, stating, quote, "They say masculinity and femininity are built into the genes, so women should get back to the mattress and the kitchen," end quote. First of all, this screams hypocrisy. Money's entire process, from the way he dressed David right down to the sexual play, involved forcing him to adhere to strict gender norms. Any time David deviated, Money saw that as a challenge to his hypothesis and chastised David for it. So this bullshit claim does not fly. David never gave a damn about dismantling stereotypes, and if it's not already clear, gender identity does not equal gender stereotypes. But what's more is that a great deal of the criticism came from intersex advocacy groups representing the demographic which has been most harmed by John Money's hypotheses about gender. For those who don't know what intersex refers to, it's a label applied to a variety of sexual presentations. You see, sex as a concept can be divided into a number of features, such as gametes, karyotype/chromosomal expression, internal sexual organs, gonads, and hormones. Though funnily enough, certain ones are removed or others are added and further divided in specific discussions. For example, there's been a push to separate hormone production and reception since people with androgen sensitivity produce testosterone at rates equivalent to your average cis male, but their cells physically cannot utilize it. In that vein, I would personally ask us to consider gender identity as part of the physical brain amongst their traits. But that's a different conversation. Thing is, all people have some sexual variance. Almost all men produce some estrogen, and almost all women produce some testosterone. The label intersex, however, only applies to the most significant examples of this blending, though the standards can be rather arbitrary, such as a phallometer, the unofficial name given to the real phallus measurement instrument by intersex advocates, such as the Intersex Society of America, and it's on the basis of said arbitrary rulings that many intersex infants and children are subject to the same cruel treatments as David Reimer, all thanks to Money's insistence that not only is gender malleable, but it's in the child's best interest to do so. As a result, countless infants undergo unnecessary cosmetic procedures designed to, and I put this in captions, normalize their body. Doctors often forward this under the premise that without said procedure, said infants would always be excluded from society. So, rather than taking a curative approach and say, tackling the misinformation and prejudice out there about intersex people, they set about using palliative surgery that ensures it goes unchallenged. Because intentions aside, said surgery further stigmatizes said intersex status. That'd be like bleaching the skin of babies of colour just so they'd never have to deal with racism. Not only would that be a horrific practice, it very likely wouldn't work. When it comes to intersex people, very often their intersex status is kept hidden from them until they're an adult. A common practice for intersex people with internal testes is to tell the child that they have ovarian cancer which needs immediate surgical treatment, else they could die. Because many parents feel better telling their child that they have cancer than letting them know that they're amongst 2% of all live births with some form of recognised intersex status, which is really part of a much wider sexual diversity seen throughout humanity. Though, it's not really fair to blame the parents since it's typically the doctors who push them into doing so. And that's why intersex groups from around the globe are calling for the depathologization of intersex statuses. And if you'd like to get involved in that, then please follow the link to the statement on screen and get in touch with one of the 66 organisations from around the world listed in support of said action. They really could do with the help. There are also charities like Genital Autonomy, which is where this pin comes from, which advocate against all forms of child genital mutilation if a more general approach is your thing. Because the fact is, whether or not a child's genitals are performed on surgically for non-medically necessary reasons should be up to that child when they grow up. Most intersex people will grow up perfectly healthy without said surgery, meaning it offers them no benefit yet has great cost in their bodily autonomy. And that's without even considering the eugenics angle in all of this and how many intersex people who are capable of having children are forcefully sterilised to ensure their genes don't propagate, since they're seen as undesirable. So benign are the effects of being intersex that many intersex people slip under the radar. Due to many of the traits such as karyotype and hormone levels not being obvious from birth, many intersex people never get detected until much later down the line. And luckily for them, that allows them to retain portions of their bodily autonomy their fellow people lack. So not only does the case of David Reimer do absolutely nothing to paint supporting trans children in a negative light, rather the opposite, but said case study has and is still being used to harm millions of people globally. And you know what? I would love to see the energy wasted on trying to police trans bodies go towards actually dismantling something which is far closer to what many people attempt to try to paint trans supportive healthcare as being. But I doubt that's about to happen, since that would require much of the fear-mongering surrounding trans people to be based on simply being misinformed, rather than active bigotry setting out to cast us as evil. But those of us who actually care about human well-being can take steps to educate others on the science of the subject, and in doing so, hopefully make the world a slightly more tolerant place. But what do you lot think? Why do people lie about the David Reimer case to try and support their bigotry? Is said practice exploitative, not simply harming trans people, but failing to address the harm caused to intersex people? What can we do to show further solidarity and active support for intersex people? Did I miss something you lot noticed? If so, be sure to leave us a comment down below. As always, please check out our other videos. You can also support Essence of Thought by Patreon, and doing so help us reach our goal of becoming ad-free. We'd also like to say a big thank you to everyone who's already given to the channel, giving a special thanks to the following people: Hannah Banghart, Matthew Kovac, Brad R, McGay, Amit Dev Vojny, Muriel Ziebenstreif, John Schoenrock, Daniel Martinez, Robert McCallan, Sam Braxton, Evan Heimber, Alexander Williams, Atlas5, and Jennifer Hiller. And from myself and Edita, take care now.